Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking lightbulb moments for paradigm shifts. On this week's episode, we get to chat with Zach Stinebaugh, currently serving as the HR Business Intelligence Analyst at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. With a master's degree in IO Psychology from a SIOP Top 5 nationally ranked program and experience in management consulting, Zach works to bring the latest in HR strategy to higher education in Charleston, South Carolina. Zach's had the good fortune of being featured by LinkedIn News, Bonfire Culture, Work in Science, the OD Network, and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. For more information about Zach and his services, be sure to check out the show notes. Hi, Zach. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. It's nice to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, this is really exciting for me. I can't wait to kind of dive into this stuff today and discuss it.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. I want to talk to you about your role as an HR business intelligence analyst. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it's quite the syllable count there. So good news there.
Yeah. Well, so you make data informed HR decisions using people analytics. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I would say primarily what my role is twofold. The first is about decision making, right? So if you look at, there's a lot of research out there that's focused on replicating the same kind of basic study, which is you give a bunch of people a few pages to read, right,
Mm-hmm.
of whatever that text is about, but there's spelling errors, grammatical errors kind of smattered throughout. And one of the things they'll do is they'll break the group into two smaller groups. The first is given a time limit, right? They have to read through the same amount of information, they just have to do it faster than the other group. And so, what all these researchers have found is that the group that has that time compression basically ends up finding less of the errors, right? So, for me, I think about those studies and I say, okay, it's pretty clear that speed and accuracy are competing interests. And so, when we overlay that onto HR, I feel like my job is to help us get a bit ahead of the issues that we may be facing, be less reactive and more proactive. And then the other piece is that data analytics that you kind of mentioned. I feel like when I'm trying to talk with my friends at like a cocktail party, their eyes will glaze over or something. And it's certainly like a bit highfalutin in terms of like the language, but really to me, it's just what are the numbers in your workplace, right? So an example, we're just coming off of summer that I was thinking about. Um, was how many camp counselors come back for a second summer after the first one, right? Or, you have lifeguards at the pools. How many of those lifeguards actually remember the first aid training they were given at the beginning of the summer? And so those are very like general workforce kind of questions. But at the end of the day, they are people analytics because they have to do with numbers and your workforce. And so when you combine those two things, it's not necessarily something that only the Metas or the Googles or the Apples of the world can deal in. We're just trying to make better decisions by getting ahead of things and using that people data.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine there must be some challenge with like translating the language, whether it's related to the numbers and what you're actually seeing in the data, or just the language around data analytics. Is that something that you're facing or have faced in the past?
Yeah, I think one of the good things about kind of my background and the program I came up in through IO psychology was that we had experience kind of speaking in the language that non-subject matter experts, SMEs, would know. And so trying to just ensure that, we're not, again, staying out of that highfalutin kind of world language and just making it pretty clear, hey, these are the expectations. This is what the numbers mean. And so trying to keep it baseline is really important.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what I would say to that.
So, what are some of the questions that you're helping business leaders answer right now?
Yeah, I think one of the major ones, right, is we have a number we have a number of questions around it, but so does the rest of the hiring world. It has to do with hiring,
Yeah.
right? So the past couple of years have shown that it's been pretty difficult to get talent, and then when you do get talent, it's real tough to keep them in the fold. And so one of the things that gets me out of bed in the morning, right, is I get to dive into survey data. And
Wow.
you may say, Zach, you're a real nerd for saying something like that. But truly, to me, it's like a puzzle, right? So
Hmm.
I get to say, what are the things that keep people at the Citadel, right? And then trying to work those themes into how we end up hiring people. So one of the analyses we've done is we've asked some of our most long tenured employees, why do you stay? And one of the things that we found is that by a long shot, it's the people they work with,
Mm.
right? So that to me really makes us, it creates a value to double down on retention. We
Hmm.
have to understand that if people are the reason that others are staying, right? If we don't take care of that, it could be a domino effect.
Mm.
And so it's really important to speak with those people, make time to connect with them, hear their frustrations, because every job has frustrations, right?
Hmm.
And then when we do know the people who are making an impact, let them know, right? So one of the other things I often get asked is like the so what, right? We get this number. What do we do with that? And so in the stay interview, we said, all right, so clearly there are some people keeping others at the Citadel. And so our great ER person, Letitia, went in and wrote handwritten notes to all of the people that were specifically mentioned. And we sent those out to the rest of the employees that were, those employees. And so one day they got to work. They had a card on their desk. They opened it up and it basically read something along the lines of, hey, thank you so much for the impact you're making. You may not even know the impact you're making, but we just asked somebody why they stayed and they specifically mentioned you. So thank you.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it's just about trying to build a bit more gratitude into the workplace, but doing that with data and doing it a little bit more strategically. Because sometimes, as an outsider, right, I might think somebody is driving, or I keep saying driving. We're keeping people at the Citadel.
Hmm.
One person may, I think, play a major role, but in reality, it's actually somebody else, right? So trying to let the data tell us that and be a little bit more proactive versus just making assumptions.
I love that you emphasize the value of stay interviews in the process of overcoming this challenge of keeping our people, right? Because it's important to in organizations we typically do our onboarding surveys, we do our 90-day surveys, we do our exit surveys, but when we dig into the data around what's keeping you here, why are you staying with us, there's valuable insights in that. And it sounds like the ability to apply qualitative actions like writing those cards as a result of the quantitative insights that you derive through those surveys, it really does like translate data to what we are trying to do, which is retain our people. And I want to know a little bit more about the stay survey. Like, what does that look like? Is it all quantitative or do you collect qualitative data? What does that look like?
Yeah, so to be totally transparent with you, it's pretty similar to our exit interview,
Hmm.
right? Because for me, I think having a pretty clear kind of dichotomy between, all right, we ask the same people that are staying and the same questions to people that are leaving, and let's compare that data. And so, a few of the items are, when did you start? Who was your manager? Kind of some of these similar scenario questions. And then also we have them rank the reasons why they stay. And then the people who are exiting or technically resigning, the reasons that you're resigning, right? If they're retiring, we don't ask them that question just because it's kind of mute to the extent that it is. But at the end of the day, that's kind of how we've decided to break it down.
Mm-hmm. And there's like Likert scale items, or when you say rank, are you
It's more forced distribution.
okay?
So, for forced choice, basically, if you will. So we have six options. One of them's like compensation, another is the people,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of buckets, I guess, if you will, for main reasons why people stay. And then after that, if we ask the question, it's an open ended question of did we miss anything, and that's a piece too. And so what we've learned is that obviously people staying is a big reason, but also the mission of what we do here at the Citadel is a big reason people stay. And if you don't mind me pitching the Citadel a little bit, it really is interesting being in higher education because unlike private industry, there is an element of sort of like, and it's not this way necessarily in all private industry, so don't get me wrong there, but there is a sense of like nobility, right? What you do is impacting the next generation of leaders, right? And you're contributing, even if it's in an indirect way,
Mm-hmm.
you're helping impact um, the world's leaders, right? And more than just making a widget or creating a software or something like that, you really get to see as those people go out into the world the impact that you've made, right? And so I think a lot of our employees recognize that, and we're a global organization, so we hire from all over the world every year.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, academia plays a big role in that. People want to be professors, but regardless, we have people knocking on our employees' doors all the time, right? But the people that choose to stay, it's because of the people they work with
Mm.
and the mission that we're on and the values that we offer.
Yeah. Well, you're a strategic partner with HR leadership, right?
Yeah,
And, it's interesting to me that you have a unique role as, an IO psychologist working in higher education. So I'm curious, what value do you think that an IO psychologist can bring to the leadership table, whether it's in higher ed or outside?
I think that's a great question. Most people that I work with don't necessarily know what IO is, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of education that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually I start out by explaining what IO is, and I use kind of the example of it was described to me as an engineer versus a mechanic. And both are great career paths, but they're very different, right? So when you need a mechanic, you kind of go in, you say, hey, this is broken, can you fix it? Versus an engineer can come in and say, hey, this is how it's supposed to work. And then let's go backwards, reverse engineer, and figure out how we get there. And so I think a lot of times IOs have the ability to say, right, this is the way that it should be. Let's maybe focus on that a little bit more than what can times in traditional HR roles be a little bit more reactive or operational, if that makes sense, and less strategic.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about that, the IO really does bring a different perspective, right? And I feel like that's valuable for a lot of places.
Yeah, but IO psychologists can kind of sit in the background sometimes. So when they are sitting at the leadership table, there's a lot to bring to that table, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like, when you think about how niche the our work is,
Mm.
it can certainly get hidden right? And it's not necessarily super strategic. But let's put it this way, right? So there's a lot of talking about quiet quitting, right? I'm a big proponent of this. I think you saw me mention it on LinkedIn. Quiet quitting is a new buzzword, and there is probably some element of newness to it. But if we go look at the research that's been going on for quite some time, the academics of the world will call it the literature, right? Let's go look at the literature, see what that says. We find that withdrawal behaviors at work, so it's different than obviously, drug related withdrawal behaviors, but there is work related withdrawal behaviors. If we go look at those and we compare the definitions, they're pretty freaking close, And so when we understand that piece of it and say, hey, so I think an IO psychologist there would say, wait a minute, I've seen this before.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a new thing. Let's go see what's already been done on it, right? And so a lot of times you'll hear IO psychologists say that they stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We are very quick to give credit to the people that came before us and did a lot of the research work before us. And so in my world, I can say to our leadership, I know that you think that quiet quitting is new, and it may be new to an extent, but there's a lot of similarities, and because there's a lot of similarities, the solutions might actually be pretty similar. And so I actually was doing a little bit of research on this.
Yeah, I'm
I saw
interested.
that there was sorry, go ahead.
I'm interested. Tell me. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I saw that there was actually somebody named Bianca Cardin's PhD, Dr. Cardenas, and they had mentioned that they had kind of pulled a lot of research on LinkedIn together to say, okay, how can we inhibit withdrawal behaviors? And one of the things that they found was humility in your leadership team is one of the driving factors of limiting withdrawal behaviors. So you say, okay, that's sort of obvious, right? But how does that work? Well, when you think about withdrawal behaviors, WBs as we call them, it's usually somebody saying, you know what, I'm okay, I don't need to do this, or it's about time for me to look for something else. I'm going to go look for a different job, or I'm just going to show up late to work because it's not important to me anymore. Those individuals, but then they also leave early. They take extended lunches, those sorts of things where they're starting to communicate openly without the words, right? That this job isn't important to me anymore.
So what's the difference between that and disengaged? Like disengagement, right?
Yeah, I would have to look at the specific definition of disengagement. But again, it could be very similar, right? It could be, for our purposes in actually practicing this stuff, it could be very similar. And so in academia, there's a valuable decision there of saying, let's try to actually parse apart these two very similar things and see what the difference is. But for us, when we're actually trying to make our workforce better, it can be a little bit of one, it could be a little bit of the other, it could be a little bit of both. So let's try to do our best to actually solve the problem and then leave academia to kind of parse apart the details, if that makes sense. That's the way I view it in my job. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about the leadership humility piece was that sometimes when people say, I've done my best, but clearly I'm not recognized here, right? Not having a humble leadership team could impact that, because if they're taking all the credit for the work that you're doing, it makes you less likely to pitch in, that extra late night, get in there early the next day. And so I think people might be missing that solution, right? Because they're focused on it being called quiet quitting, and they're looking at all the new news articles that are out there around quiet quitting. So you asked me about what an IO psychologist could do at a leadership table. That could save a lot of time, right? If they are proposing a solution in a much quicker way than the roundabout way of studying it and figuring out the impacts, which certainly can be good in some situations. But I think leadership also would like to say, hey, if you can figure this out quickly, let's do that.
Yeah, and bring that research and that science-based, science-backed data in the room, because if we don't look at that, then we are spinning our wheels, right? We're just kind of on a hamster wheel, just cycling back, over and over and over, across, whatever one other organization is doing. So we get a
Yeah.
competitive advantage when we have an IO psychologist at the table, because they are experts in research and academics.
Yeah, and they probably know a couple other IOs that when they message them, like I know our cohort group chat, we'll text each other if we have a weird situation or something and say, "Hey, does this sound right to you?" And so, I mean, I know that my company benefits from that because I'll tell some of my people, "Hey, in very I obviously won't give away organizational secrets, right?
Mhm.
But I can say, hey, have you seen much about engaging this group of employees? Like, what have y'all done to manage that a little bit better? And
Mhm.
so, kind of working as a team, you get that added benefit of having a network of people that if you don't know the research on it, maybe one of your friends does. And
Mhm.
so, I think that's a pretty neat factor in such a tight knit community.
Yeah. What are the biggest challenges that you've helped so far using people analytics? Like, what's been the most exciting for you?
Yeah, I would say, again, trying to pull back from this idea of statistical modeling and MANOVAs and MANCOVAs and all those things. One of the things I try to do is just drive real value based on the statistics that we do have, right? And so one of those is that 40% of our new hires come from outside the metro of Charleston. So at the
Mhm.
Citadel, like I said, we're a global organization, but 40% of your people coming from outside the metro and what is traditionally like, you know, an industry that can pull on a lot of the local talent, 40% is a pretty big number, right? And
Mhm.
so for me, this manifests as a little bit of an anecdote, right? So I just moved from St. Louis. I say just, I'm about to be a year into my position. But when I was doing some research on the company, I didn't know much about Charleston. So
Mhm.
I said, I have a few questions. And so our recruiter, Angie, who does a really great job, had to basically manage, she's like the one recruiter for the whole college,
Wow.
right? So talk about a workload. But she has all these people asking her constantly, hey, when I move down here, where should I live? Hey, where are the best schools? Hey, what, all those questions that are a very real part of the prospective employee's life, right? Trying to get settled down here. And we talk about retention,
Right.
right? Building some roots down here is a great way to help keep them, you know, hopefully with us in the Charleston area because we're a major player in this market.
Mhm.
And so when I saw those things and I experienced it, I said, we need to say to our 40% of people, hey, you're just as important as the 60% that are here. And so one of the projects that we had was revamping the website. And if you're interested, it's go.citadel.edu/human-resources. But that's just a shameless plug. Um, and so what we did was we put all of that information on the Living in Charleston page. We put a bunch of links out there. We totally revamped the visual nature of it to where it really is a digital storefront for us, right? I think the rest of kind of private industry had already gotten to that point of saying, hey, our careers page is how the rest of our potential applicants, our new hires are going to perceive us. So let's do our best to put our best foot forward and give them all the information they can need. And then we also integrated an FAQs page, right? So a lot of these same questions that people keep asking, now we've got those documented. So a person who's just passively looking, they can get those answers themselves without having to email somebody or something like that. So that was a big piece. And then the other piece that we took that 40% data and we utilized it was the launch of our executive HR sponsorship program. And what that is think about you're a new applicant that's in the finalist stage, right? You'll actually get an email from me. If you're applying to the Citadel, you're a finalist, you get an email from Zach saying, hey, these are our local partners. If you're outside the area, it might be a really good idea to connect with them and say, hey, I don't know which way is up. So A, that pulls the responsibility off of Angie, who frankly probably isn't, super qualified to answer all of those details in an ever-changing market like Charleston that keeps growing,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then it also helps some of the partners that we've, you know, selected to be in this group, and they get some potential leads out of this for the people that choose to reach back out, right? We're not giving anyone's email away.
Mm-hmm.
We're simply providing uh, the sponsor's contact information to the finalists. And so what's great about that is for the partners that we have, even if the Citadel doesn't hire them, but they do decide that they want to live in Charleston, because clearly that's been, you know, expressed to an extent, they have that information already, right? But then if they also, if we end up hiring them, then they can kind of slide right into having a local expert there helping them get settled. So that's kind of a couple of the ways that we've looked to do that. Right now, it's predominantly real estate agents, but the hope is one day we can get a moving company involved. We could get a bank involved. Places that have roots in Charleston, and just help that transition, because it's already tough when you have to go learn a new job. Let's try to make it a little bit easier on the employee when they have to move to a new city.
And you're supporting the community as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
We feel like
impact.
it's a win on all sides.
Yeah, the impact of it's so cool to see that you're taking this data and you're applying and utilizing it to attract and retain employees. And then on top of it, the impact is just expanding beyond that. So you're just bringing, really good stuff to the community. I love that. And all from a data set. That's insane.
Yeah, yeah. I always joke that people analysts deal in people and numbers, right? And if you're not thinking about both, then you're kind of missing half of the equation.
Right.
So there's a lot of emotional kind of nature of the stuff that we deal with, right? Getting somebody settled in a new life, they're more than just a data point,
Yeah.
right? But at the same time, we can't only deal in emotion. We
Mhm.
have to bring some logic to the situation. And so I feel like people analytics is a great way to meld those two
Meld
things.
them together. Yeah, and the data gives us things to a place to start, right? It allows us to see trends, but also gives us a starting point so that we can then better support people. And we're talking a lot about people analytics in terms of like hiring, and you have a pulse on people data, but I imagine it gives you trends around other things like development, performance, the entire employee life cycle. So what are you currently noticing in terms of trends with either within your organization or in outside of that?
I would say one of the things that we're looking at kind of that's on the outside of those two things, the what we've talked about so far, the attraction and the retention, really is performance, right? And so this is another thing that kind of falls under my job description, performance management. The IOs in the room will kind of say, well, is it performance appraisal or performance management? And so probably it's more the appraisal piece, but what we end up seeing is that we pull all of this stuff together, right? This is again kind of what gets me excited about the role is I can say, gosh, if the reason people are leaving, it predominantly has to do with not getting enough feedback, not getting enough recognition, those sorts of things. Those are very in-house elements that we can manage, right? And certainly it's difficult right now for a lot of places. They have limited numbers of employees. So they may be short-staffed in certain departments or whatever. So it's not always perfect, right? But we've talked about this before offline. That the
Mhm.
messiness is what makes this so interesting, right? And so challenging to an extent. Because if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Mhm.
But what I think we've seen is that we've got very clearly performance management, performance appraisal elements to the reason people exit.
Mhm.
So one of my jobs, and I just did this last week, was to go in and train on what good objectives look like, right? What good performance conversations look like. And so I think a lot of places you'll see them moving away from the annual review because if it's done poorly, you might as well not do it at all
Yeah.
because you're evaluating somebody on something that the goals that you created 12 months ago, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about, a really good example here, but it's sort of hyperbolic, is the pandemic, right? So if you had created some of your goals for your employees pre-pandemic, and then your evaluation was 12 months later, your whole perspective on what success looks like has changed. It went from, hey, let's keep growing, let's keep progressing, to let's just stay alive. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
keep this thing going and we'll live to fight another day. But the issue is that if we're not having multiple performance conversations, then we miss out on the chance to reset expectations and let the employee exceed those, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or um, another example, right? If they aren't meeting the goals, there may be a chance to say, okay, let's maybe our goals are a little bit too intense for them to start.
Mm-hmm.
Let's rein it back in, let them get some confidence. And so obviously that's dependent upon the employee, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but having consistent conversations about performance, not in a way that has to be so um, calculated and so structured. I get that that's an ideal scenario for a lot of HR people out there, but from the perspective of the employee, like they just may not feel they have time.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're talking about, 4 10-minute to 15-minute conversations throughout the year, that's less than an hour unless you're doing the 15-minute increments, in which case, obviously it's an hour. But that's if
Yeah.
we can't find an hour to talk about performance, we have some other issues, right? And so I think
Mm-hmm.
taking all of that together, that's important to consider.
Yeah, and I think those mini performance reviews, the continuous feedback is so critical because, to your point, when you do the end of year review and it's been a whole year since we've talked about the skills, the goals, the care, the KPIs, any of that. You introduce a lot of bias in terms when it comes to performance rating and performance evaluations, like recency bias and those kind of things. From the manager's perspective. And also, I think a lot of performance reviews year end can be limiting if it's just the manager doing the review and it's not a self assessment or self evaluation as well as potential coworkers or like a 360, a peer-to-peer evaluation. So in
Right.
my firm, we do two continuous feedback sessions is what we call them, and then a year-end performance review. And so those two throughout the year are really developmental and performance focused. How can I help you reach your goals? What development needs do you have? What skills would you like to learn more about? And then at the end of the year, when there is that final performance review that's more structured, there's some context to it. There is some gravity to it. It's not a surprise to the employee, and also it helps the employee course correct prior to the end of year review. So I love that you're taking that data from this exit surveys to improve a process that you currently have.
Yeah, and I think what it sounds like you're doing is a really, really great process. Certainly, we are, in our organization, still trying to build a lot of that, which is great because it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think, like you said, if we can have more data to make decisions, that's better than having no data.
No
And,
data.
and so sometimes those annual performance reviews can just never happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if those aren't happening, then you have no data. So
Yeah.
then how are you promoting? How are you
Making
deciding?
decisions.
Yeah, how are you making any decisions, right? And
Mhm.
so usually, like you mentioned, when those things are absent, bias sneaks itself into there and creates problems.
So, if an organization is fairly new in many of their people programs or processes, they aren't collecting data. Like, where would they start? How could they start?
Yeah. So, like any good psychologist, I'm going to say it depends. But I will also say that the factor here to consider is what's the most pressing, right? Because if you're getting this thing off the ground, there certainly is some buy-in, probably from leadership, that you need to be making more data-driven decisions, but you also need to provide proof that that practice is valuable, or else it's probably going to get scrapped because you never had it to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say understanding leadership's goals is critically important,
Mm-hmm.
because their goals are now your goals. And sometimes you want to support the decisions, if it seems like that's what the employees are feeling. But then sometimes you also want to have a little bit of pushback, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding your leader will also impact a lot of this. For example, right, if you come in with all this data, that this is I feel like the art of the science of people analytics. You do have to sometimes convince people that what you're doing is valuable. And so if they are struggling with a specific challenge,
Mm-hmm.
coming with data that can help get them an answer and solve that is a great first step. And then you can start to dig into the more kind of important, but also fundamental pieces of people analytics. So I would say start with what your leadership cares about. Try to make a case with data for why, frankly, you should keep the people analytics group going, and then start to sort of dig into those topics that may be a little bit harder to have, right? But that are extremely valuable in terms of driving the business forward.
That's great. And I have one last question for you, Zach, as we wrap up. What is the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced, whether it's related to this work or outside of it? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I would say moving, right? I think one of the things that I didn't realize was how many things I took for granted in the place that I lived. I could go get my hair cut. I could go to the dry cleaners. I could, do whatever it was that I needed to do during the day, and I knew exactly where to go. But when you move, it's all new, right? And so your brain's working like 3 or 4 times as hard as it ever used to. You're trying to figure out exactly where everything is all the time. Your house probably, or your apartment, has boxes all around it, so it's a lot more stressful. But it's also an opportunity to see things in a new way and an opportunity to learn.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Well, it's been a pleasure having us chat with you, and I look forward to hearing and following your journey along as you continue to progress in your role. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I'm so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.